The biting winter wind of New York City slithered between the skyscrapers of Madison Avenue, carrying with it the muffled hum of a city that never sleeps. Clara, a 19-year-old young woman, clutched her only coat close to her body, a gift she had received from Mrs. Zephyr, the kind-hearted lady who served soup to the needy every Thursday. The threadbare fabric barely managed to keep out the chill that seeped in through its worn seams, but it was all she had. On that particularly frigid July night, Clara watched the stream of executives leaving their offices, carrying leather briefcases and wearing imported coats. From her seat on the steps of a centuries-old church, she imagined the stories behind every hurried face, dreaming of the day when she, too, would have a place to call her own. It was then that her brown eyes fell upon an unusual figure, an elderly gentleman dressed in simple attire, perhaps too simple for that part of the city, who walked with difficulty, visibly trembling from the cold. Something about him caught her attention. Perhaps it was the way he observed the people around him, with a look that was more curious than desperate, a stark contrast to the other homeless individuals Clara was accustomed to seeing. Without a second thought, she rose and walked over to him. "Are you cold? You can have my coat," she offered, already beginning to remove the only protection she had against the relentless winter. The man looked at her in surprise, his blue eyes gleaming in a way that Clara couldn't quite decipher. "But it's your only one, young lady," he replied in a husky yet gentle voice. Clara smiled, the kind of smile that lit up her face even on the hardest days. "That's true, but you need it more than I do right now. Besides, I'll be heading to Mrs. Maria's shelter soon. Have you heard of it? It's just a few blocks from here." The man accepted the coat hesitantly, his eyes never leaving Clara's face. There was something in his gaze, a blend of admiration and curiosity, that made her feel strangely hopeful. They talked for a few minutes, sharing stories of life on the streets. Clara spoke of her dreams of studying, of one day working in one of the towering buildings on the avenue, and of helping others who, like her, only needed an opportunity. What Clara didn't know was that this humble-looking man was Albert Mendez, the president of one of the country's largest companies. For weeks, he had been incognito, immersing himself in the gritty world of New York's streets, determined to understand the true reality of those less fortunate. On his journey, he had encountered stories of despair and resignation, but never had he witnessed an act of genuine kindness quite like Clara's. When they parted ways, Clara insisted that he keep the coat. "Tomorrow the sun will rise," she said with conviction, as if her unwavering faith in tomorrow could command the weather. "And when it does, I'll feel a little less cold knowing I've helped someone." Albert watched her recede into the cold night, her slender silhouette gradually vanishing. At that moment, he made a decision that would not only change Clara's life, but also the future of his own company. He pulled a small notebook from his pocket and scribbled down a few instructions for his assistant, a plan beginning to take shape in his experienced mind. The next morning, as the first rays of sun started to gild the buildings on Madison Avenue, Clara discovered something unexpected near her usual sleeping spot, a black leather briefcase with a carefully folded note inside. With trembling hands, Clara opened the note tucked into the briefcase. The elegant handwriting contrasted sharply with the plain paper. "Your generosity on that cold night showed me that there are still extraordinary people in this world. Inside this briefcase, you will find an opportunity to transform your life and perhaps the lives of many others. The address below awaits you tomorrow at 9 a.m. Bring your dreams with you." Upon opening the briefcase, Clara had to sit down. Besides an amount of money she had never seen in her life, there was a set of brand new business clothes, documents bearing her name, including some she had lost years ago, and an ID badge from Mendez Corporation, one of the country's largest companies. That morning, her first instinct was to look for her friends on the streets. She found Mrs. Zephyr serving coffee at her usual corner. The kindly woman, who for the past 2 years had treated Clara like her own daughter, wept upon hearing the news. "Go on, my dear. God never gives us opportunities by accident," she said, gently taming Clara's unruly hair with her weathered hands. The following day, dressed in her new clothes and with her heart pounding, Clara stepped through the revolving doors of the imposing Mendez Corporation building. The marble and glass lobby reflected the sunlight, creating a dazzling play of colors that left her momentarily breathless. At reception, a middle-aged lady named Marina greeted her with a warm smile. "You must be Clara. We've been expecting you," she said, escorting her to a private elevator. During the ascent to the 30th floor, Clara struggled to control her breathing, mentally rehearsing everything she needed to say. The elevator doors opened directly into a conference room, boasting a panoramic view of the city. Inside, aside from several executives in formal attire, was him, the man in the coat. Now, however, he was wearing an impeccable suit and occupied the head of the table, his presence exuding natural authority. "Welcome, Clara," said Albert Mendez as he rose to greet her. "I believe we have much to discuss." His smile was the same as on that cold night, but there was something more in his eyes, a blend of expectation and determination that Clara couldn't fully understand. Then he began to explain. Clara had been selected for a special one-year training program. She would compete with 9 other candidates for a permanent position within the company. The program included formal education with private tutors to help her complete high school, in addition to training in various areas of the company. "But why me?" Clara asked, her voice betraying her insecurity. Albert smiled, reaching for the familiar coat on the back of his chair, the very coat Clara had given him. "Because in all my years of experience, I've never met someone who, despite having so little, could give so much." The meeting continued with a presentation of the program details. Clara met Marina, an HR executive who would be her direct mentor, and received her first schedule of activities. She was also informed that a furnished apartment would be at her disposal throughout the program. At the end of the meeting, after everyone had left, Albert called her aside. "Clara, I know this might seem like a dream, but I want you to understand one thing. This isn't charity. I saw something special in you that night, a quality this company desperately needs. Use this opportunity not only to change your own life, but to show everyone that kindness and success are not mutually exclusive." That afternoon, as Clara left the building, the city appeared transformed. The same skyscrapers that once made her feel small and insignificant now seemed to beckon with endless possibilities. In her chest, alongside hope, there was also the heavy weight of not disappointing the trust Albert Mendez had placed in her. The apartment Clara received was located in a middle-class neighborhood close to a subway station. It wasn't luxurious, but for someone who had spent the last few years sleeping on the streets, it felt like a palace. The first night was strange. The silence and comfort of the bed were almost unsettling for someone used to the constant clamor of the city. The next morning, on her first official day of work, Clara woke before her alarm. She dressed in the simplest outfit among her new clothes and gathered her hair into a modest bun. Looking in the mirror, she barely recognized the person staring back at her. Yet her eyes still held that unmistakable sparkle that even the hardest years hadn't been able to dim. Upon arriving at the company, she was greeted by her mentor, Marina, a woman in her 40s with a warm smile and keen eyes. "Let's start by introducing you to the other program participants," Marina said, leading Clara to a training room on the 20th floor. The other 9 candidates were already there, all young, well-dressed, and obviously well-educated. Clara felt the weight of curious stares as she entered. Among them stood out a young woman who looked as though she had stepped off the cover of a fashion magazine, dressed in designer clothes with impeccable poise. Beatrice Mendez, Albert's granddaughter. "So, you're the famous protégé of my grandfather," Beatrice remarked, her tone oscillating between curiosity and disdain. "Interesting. You must have quite a story to tell." Her comment drew a few discreet chuckles from some of the other participants. Marina quickly intervened, beginning the formal introductions. The group was diverse in their backgrounds. There were freshly graduated engineers, business administrators from renowned companies, and even a young technology prodigy, Peter Santos, who caught Clara's attention by being the only one to offer her a genuine smile. During that first week, Clara balanced private classes to complete high school with basic corporate training about the company's operations. In her spare moments, she devoured books from the corporate library. determined to make up for years of missed formal education. It was during one of these study sessions that she met Mrs. Gertrude, the lady who ran the cafeteria and would become her first true ally in this new world. With her neatly arranged silver hair and a maternal way of serving coffee, Mrs. Gertrude had the gift of making anyone feel at home. "You remind me so much of someone," Mrs. Gertrude remarked one afternoon as she watched Clara studying intently. "You have the same sparkle in your eyes as a former employee." Her voice faltered for a moment, as if the memory brought pain, but she quickly changed the subject. At the end of that first week, Albert Mendez announced the program's first challenge. Each participant was to develop a corporate social responsibility project for the company. They had 3 months to present their proposals, which would be judged by a special committee. Clara's heart raced. Finally, an opportunity to use her life experience constructively. That very night, she decided to visit her old street companions. She found Mrs. Zephyr at her usual corner, handing out soup. "My dear," the lady exclaimed upon seeing her, a broad smile spreading across her face. "Look at you, so elegant. But you haven't forgotten about us, have you?" Clara hugged her tightly, tears in her eyes. "I could never forget. In fact, I need your help, Mrs. Zephyr. I want to create a project that will give others the same chance I've had." As they talked, Clara did not notice that she was being watched. From inside a luxurious car parked on the corner, Beatrice Mendez snapped photos with her cell phone, a mischievous smile playing on her lips. "So this is how you plan to win my grandfather's trust," she murmured to herself. "Let's see how long this charade lasts." The following weeks brought an intense routine for Clara. By day, she alternated between private lessons and corporate training sessions. By night, she dedicated herself to her social project, conducting research and interviews with people living on the streets. Her commitment did not go unnoticed by Marina, who began assigning her increasingly challenging responsibilities. On one particularly hectic morning, Clara bumped into a cleaning staff member in the corridor on the 20th floor. As she helped her pick up spilled cleaning supplies, their eyes met for a brief moment. The woman, who appeared to be around 40, froze as if she had seen a ghost. I'm sorry," the employee stammered, quickly retreating. Clara noticed that her ID badge identified her as Helena Santos. There was something familiar in her eyes, but Clara couldn't quite place what it was. When she mentioned the incident to Mrs. Gertrude, the cafeteria manager grew oddly agitated. "Helena has worked here for over 15 years, Mrs. Gertrude said hesitantly. "She's a very reserved woman, hardly ever speaking about her personal life." There was something in her tone that suggested she knew more than she was letting on. Meanwhile, Clara's social project was beginning to take shape. Her proposal was to create a professional training program for people in vulnerable situations, offering not only technical training, but also psychological support and continuous follow-up. Her years on the streets had taught her that true transformation required more than mere opportunities. It was about rebuilding self-esteem and confidence. Peter Santos, the young technology whiz, began to approach Clara during training breaks. Unlike the other participants, he showed genuine interest in her ideas and experiences. "You know, I also come from a tough background," he confided one day. "I grew up in the outskirts and only managed to study because I earned a scholarship." The growing closeness between them did not escape Beatrice's notice. The granddaughter of Albert, who had initially treated Clara with disdain, now seemed to harbor an increasingly evident antipathy, especially when she observed the frequent conversations between Clara and Peter. It was during one of those discussions that Clara discovered something intriguing. Peter was developing an artificial intelligence system to identify hidden talents among the company's employees. "It's amazing how many people possess extraordinary skills but never get a chance to showcase them," he explained, his eyes sparkling with enthusiasm. The idea ignited a spark in Clara's mind. What if she could incorporate something similar into her social project? Technology could be a powerful tool to identify potential and create more targeted opportunities. With Peter's help, she began to expand her original proposal. However, not everything was smooth sailing. One day, Clara found her workspace in disarray and some of her project documents missing. Marina launched an internal investigation, but nothing was uncovered. The incident only strengthened Clara's determination to prove her worth. Albert Mendez watched Clara's progress with particular interest. During a follow-up meeting, he noted how she had adapted her language to the corporate environment without losing the authenticity that had so impressed him that winter night. "You're transforming this company more than you imagine," he said, his tone enigmatic. "Sometimes the greatest changes begin in the most unexpected ways." There was something in his voice, a blend of pride and urgency, that Clara couldn't entirely decipher. What she didn't know was that later that same afternoon, Albert had an important medical consultation scheduled. His recent tests hadn't brought good news, and time was becoming increasingly precious for him to carry out his plans. Looking out the window of his office, he watched as Clara chatted animatedly with Peter in the ground-floor cafe. A sad smile crossed his lips. So many secrets yet to be revealed, so many truths left unsaid. Spring arrived in New York City, bringing not only blossoms to the Mendez Corporation's surroundings, but also new challenges for Clara. Her social project was about to be presented to the executive committee, and she spent long hours at the company, refining every detail with Peter's assistance. One evening, while working late and taking a break for coffee, Clara heard raised voices coming from a nearby meeting room. She immediately recognized the voice of Helena Santos, the same cleaning lady who had reacted so strangely when she saw her weeks ago. "You can't keep hiding this from her, Gertrude," Helena cried, her voice choked with emotion. "Every time I see her in the corridors, my heart shatters. She has the same smile as her father, the same eyes." Clara froze in place. Before she could catch the rest of Mrs. Gertrude's response, the sound of approaching footsteps made her quickly retreat. Her heart pounded. What exactly were they talking about? And why did the mention of her father, whom she had never known, leave her with such an unsettling feeling? The next morning, during her project presentation, Clara tried to concentrate, but the words from the previous night wouldn't leave her mind. In front of the executive committee, including Albert Mendez and his granddaughter Beatrice, she presented her proposal, a program called Bridges to the Future, which would combine technology and a human touch to create job opportunities for people in vulnerable situations. The unique aspect of this project lies in the use of the talent identification system developed by Peter Santos, Clara explained, her voice firm despite her nervousness. "We don't just want to offer jobs, we want to discover and nurture hidden potential." The presentation was a success. Even Beatrice, who had once been the first to criticize, remained quietly reflective. Albert Mendez appeared especially moved. "This project," he said, his voice slightly trembling, "represents exactly the kind of change I've always dreamed of for this company." Yet the joy of the achievement was short-lived. Upon returning to her desk, Clara found a mysterious envelope waiting for her. Inside was an old, time-yellowed photograph. In it, a young couple smiled for the camera, a man bearing a striking resemblance to Clara and a woman she immediately recognized, a much younger Helena Santos. On the back of the photo was a single sentence: "Some secrets must be brought to light." Clara felt her world spin. Her hands trembled as she tucked the photo into her bag. At that moment, Beatrice passed by her desk, noticing her agitation. "Is something wrong, Clara?" she asked with feigned concern. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "It's nothing," Clara replied, trying to regain her composure. But Beatrice didn't move away. Instead, she sat at the edge of the desk, something she had never done before. "You know, Clara, I've always wondered why my grandfather chose you," Beatrice began in a low, measured tone. "He was never one for impulsive decisions. So I did a little investigating. It's amazing how some coincidences can be so intriguing." Beatrice's tone made it clear she knew something important. Before Clara could respond, Peter appeared, interrupting the conversation. He brought exciting news about the talent identification system, but immediately sensed the tension in the air. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. The photograph, Beatrice's words, Helena's reaction, everything swirled in her mind like pieces of a puzzle she couldn't quite put together. She decided it was time to seek answers. The next morning she arrived at the company early, determined to speak with Mrs. Gertrude. The cafeteria manager always seemed to know more than she let on, and Clara was convinced that she was a key piece in this mystery. Mrs. Gertrude was already at her station when Clara arrived at the cafe. The space was still empty, except for a few cleaning staff finishing their early morning shifts. Among them, Clara spotted Helena, who immediately averted her gaze upon seeing her. "We need to talk," Clara said, placing the old photograph on the counter. Mrs. Gertrude paled at the sight, her experienced hands trembling slightly as she prepared the morning coffee. "Not here," the lady whispered, glancing nervously around. "Meet me at Liberty Park after work. Some stories must be told at the right moment in the right place." The day dragged on as if the hours had decided to move in slow motion. Clara tried to focus on her tasks, but her mind kept returning to the mysterious photograph and Mrs. Gertrude's enigmatic words. That afternoon, she had a meeting with Albert Mendez to discuss the next steps for the Bridges to the Future project. The businessman seemed more subdued than usual, yet his eyes still sparkled with the same intensity when he spoke about the transformations the project could bring. "Clara," he said, pausing for a moment, "do you believe that people deserve second chances?" The question took Clara by surprise. "Sometimes," he continued, "we make mistakes that seem impossible to mend, but perhaps the universe offers us opportunities for redemption when we least expect them." There was something in Albert's voice, a mixture of regret and hope, that touched Clara deeply. Before she could answer, they were interrupted by Beatrice, who entered the room without knocking. "Grandpa, we need to talk about the contract with the Chinese investors," she said, casting a cold look at Clara. "It's urgent." After work, Clara made her way to Liberty Park. There she found Mrs. Gertrude sitting on a bench near the central fountain. The lady looked as though she had aged 10 years since the morning. "Your mother was one of the brightest employees I ever knew," Mrs. Gertrude began, catching Clara off guard. "Helena started out as a cleaning assistant, but she had a natural talent with numbers. In her spare time, she'd study the financial reports she'd find in the executive's trash." Clara listened intently, her heart pounding faster with every word. "Your father, Richard, was the son of Albert Mendez. He met Helena at a company holiday party. It was love at first sight." Mrs. Gertrude paused, her eyes brimming with tears. But Albert did not approve of the relationship. Richard was his only son, and he had other plans for the future of the company. When Helena discovered she was pregnant, Richard decided to confront his father. There was a terrible argument. Mrs. Gertrude's voice faltered. "What happened next?" Clara asked, barely able to breathe. "Richard left in a fury that night. He had a serious accident on the West Side Highway." Mrs. Gertrude took Clara's hand. Helena was devastated. Albert, consumed by guilt, was never the same again. She decided to put you up for adoption, believing it was best for everyone. She continued working at the company, tormenting herself daily over the decision she had made. Clara felt her world tilt. So many pieces began to fall into place. Helena's fleeting looks, Albert's special attention, Beatrice's insinuations. But before she could process everything, her phone rang. It was Marina, her voice urgent. "Clara, you need to come to Einstein Medical Center immediately. Mr. Mendez isn't feeling well from a meeting. He's asking to see you." The hospital. Corridor seemed interminably long as Clara raced toward the room indicated by the receptionist. Her heart still reeling from Mrs. Gertrude's revelations, she found Beatrice seated in an armchair in the waiting area, her eyes red from crying. "He had a collapse during the meeting with the investors," Beatrice explained, her usual hostility, replaced by a vulnerability Clara had never seen before. "The doctors say it's stress, but—" Her voice trailed off, and for the first time the two young women, who hadn't even known they were cousins, shared a moment of genuine concern. Inside the room, Albert Mendez appeared small and fragile against the stark white hospital sheets. Upon seeing Clara, his eyes lit up. "My granddaughter," he whispered, extending his trembling hand toward her. Clara felt tears stream down her face. It was the first time she had heard those words. "I know everything," Clara said softly, holding her grandfather's hand. "Mrs. Gertrude told me about my parents." Albert closed his eyes for a moment, as if summoning strength. "I lost my son because of my pride and prejudice," he confessed. "I spent years trying to make amends. When I met you that winter night, I saw in your act of kindness the same generous heart your father possessed. I knew it was my chance to right my wrongs." Their conversation was interrupted by the entrance of Helena, who came in with flowers for the room. Upon seeing Clara beside Albert's bed, she dropped the vase. The clatter attracted Beatrice, who had been waiting in the corridor. The room fell into complete silence as the 4 generations of the Mendez family met for the first time. "I think it's time for all our masks to fall," Albert declared, his voice growing stronger. He explained to Beatrice that Clara was not just a young woman he had decided to help. She was his niece, the daughter of Richard, the uncle she had never known. Beatrice's reaction surprised everyone. Instead of the expected explosion, she began to cry. "Is that why you were digging into her past?" Albert asked, and Beatrice nodded. "I found some old photos in your office," she explained between sobs. "I recognized Helena as a child. I started piecing things together, but I didn't want to believe it. I was afraid of losing my place in the company, in the family." Helena, who had remained silent until now, finally approached Clara. "Forgive me," she whispered, touching her daughter's face for the first time in 19 years. "I thought I was protecting you, but I was only protecting myself from my own cowardice." Albert observed the scene with a mixture of joy and sorrow. "Helena," he called, drawing everyone's attention, "I always knew about your gift with numbers. I saw you secretly poring over every financial report. Your daughter inherited not only your looks, but also your intelligence and determination." It was then that Clara understood. Her project Bridges to the Future wasn't just about giving opportunities to strangers. It was about recognizing the value of people regardless of their origins or social standing. It was about building bridges between worlds that seemed too distant to connect. "The project needs an executive director," Albert continued, "someone who deeply understands both sides of the bridge we want to build." His gaze shifted from Clara to Helena. "The two of you together are exactly what this company needs." Quietly, Beatrice stepped forward. "I'd like to be a part of this too," she said, her voice still thick with emotion. "Perhaps I have some ideas to expand the program to other companies in the group." At that moment, something shifted in the hospital room's atmosphere. The walls that had separated these 4 people began to crumble, not through the force of violent demolition, but through the gentle power of forgiveness and mutual understanding. The following weeks brought significant changes to Mendez Corporation. With Albert still recovering at home, Clara, Helena, and Beatrice assumed responsibility for implementing the Bridges to the Future project. News spread quickly through the corridors that Clara was the granddaughter of the company's president and that Helena, the cleaning lady, was her mother. Mrs. Gertrude watched with satisfaction as the 3 women worked side by side in the cafeteria, which had become their informal headquarters. "You remind me of an old tale," she said one afternoon while serving coffee to the group, "about a girl who shared her only coat on a cold night, not knowing that that gesture would change not only her life, but the lives of so many others." Clara smiled, recalling that night, which now seemed to belong to another lifetime. Now, her old coat was framed on Albert's office wall, a constant reminder that small acts of kindness can have extraordinary consequences. The training program began with a pilot project, selecting 20 individuals from vulnerable backgrounds. Among them was Jose, an elderly man Clara had met on the streets who, as Peter's system revealed, had a natural talent for gardening. In just a few weeks, he was revolutionizing the company's gardens with sustainable landscaping techniques. Peter, who continued refining the talent identification system, started working more closely with Beatrice. Their daily hours in the ETM tech lab gradually transformed her initial antipathy into something different. Clara often caught them chatting animatedly about technology and social innovation, and she couldn't help but notice the lingering glances they exchanged when they thought no one was watching. Helena, for her part, finally had the opportunity to showcase her numerical prowess. Under Marina's guidance, she took over the project's financial management, proving that her skill with spreadsheets and reports went far beyond what anyone had imagined. In Albert's words, watching everything from his hospital room, she was living proof that the greatest talents can be hidden in the most unexpected places. One afternoon, while organizing Mendez Corporation's first charity festival, Clara found Beatrice crying in the restroom. "You know what's ironic?" her cousin said while dabbing her tears. "I spent so much time afraid of losing my place in this family that I didn't realize I was missing the chance to make it greater and stronger." The charity event was an absolute triumph. In the company's courtyard, suited executives danced a traditional quadrille alongside people who, until recently, had been living on the streets. Mrs. Zephyr, especially invited by Clara, ran the stall for typical sweets, her coconut candies so popular that 3 businessmen had already proposed setting up production. "Your mother made the best coconut candy I've ever tasted," remarked Albert, who had received special permission from his doctors to attend the celebration. He watched Helena instructing a group of executives on how to dance a local folk style, her face alight with a joy she hadn't shown in years. "She used to sell sweets right at the company's doorstep before she got a cleaning job. That's how your father met her." Clara absorbed every new detail about her parents, as if a parched land were finally receiving rain. Every little piece helped fill the void of a story that had long been denied to her. "Why did you never look for me before?" she finally asked. Albert fell silent for a moment, his eyes fixed on the lively party. "Fear," he finally replied. "Fear of not deserving a second chance, of you blaming me for your father's tragedy. That cold winter night was what showed me that forgiveness and kindness are stronger than any guilt." Their conversation was interrupted by Peter, who announced that his system had identified an interesting pattern. Many of the project's beneficiaries possessed complementary talents that could be combined to create small cooperative businesses. The success of the charity festival sparked a wave of changes at Mendez Corporation. The Bridges to the Future project began attracting media attention, and soon other companies expressed interest in replicating the model. Clara, now officially recognized as part of the Mendez family, divided her time between corporate responsibilities and visits to her grandfather in the hospital. During one of those visits, Albert shared news that caught everyone by surprise. He had decided to expedite the company's succession. "Time teaches us when it's right for change," he said, looking meaningfully at Clara, Helena, and Beatrice, who were present. "But Grandpa," protested Beatrice, "you're recovering well. The doctors said you'd be discharged soon." Albert smiled that wise smile Clara had come to recognize. "Precisely because of that, my dear, I want time to guide you, to watch this company transform in the hands of a new generation." News of the accelerated succession stirred up the corridors of the company. Some of the more conservative executives expressed concern about having Helena, the former cleaning lady, in an executive position. Others questioned Clara's experience, despite her successful project. It was then that Beatrice surprised everyone by calling an extraordinary board meeting. "My grandfather taught me that a company isn't built solely on diplomas and surnames," she declared firmly. "It's built on vision, courage, and above all, on people who have their hearts in the right place." Peter, watching the meeting, couldn't take his eyes off Beatrice. The transformation she had undergone in recent months was remarkable. The once arrogant young woman who cared only about status and appearances now passionately defended a project of social inclusion. After the meeting, the two met in the cafeteria. "You were amazing in there," Peter said, sitting beside her. Beatrice blushed slightly, toying with her coffee cup. "I learned so much over these past months," she replied. "From Clara, from Helena, and from you." Their moment was interrupted by Mrs. Gertrude, who arrived with a tray of fresh cookies. "Did you know your grandfather and grandmother fell in love right here in this very cafeteria?" she remarked with a mischievous smile, causing Beatrice to choke on her coffee. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, Clara and Helena visited the old neighborhood where Richard, Clara's father, had grown up. "Your father adored that ice cream parlor," Helena recalled, pointing to a long-standing establishment on the corner. "It was there that he asked me to be his girlfriend, nervous as he was, with a melting pistachio ice cream in hand." They strolled along the streets, reconstructing through Helena's memories a love story that time had not managed to erase. In front of an old church, Helena paused, her hands trembling slightly. "This is where we were secretly married. Only Mrs. Gertrude and the priest knew." Clara absorbed every word, every detail, feeling increasingly connected to the father she never knew. "What was he like?" she asked softly. "Stubborn, just like you," Helena replied, laughing through tears, and his eyes sparkled when he talked about his dreams. He wanted to transform his father's company into something more than just numbers on a balance sheet. He wanted to create real opportunities for real people. Back at the company, Clara noticed unusual activity in the lobby. A group of international executives had arrived to learn about the Bridges to the Future project. Among them was James Thompson, a charming English investor, who showed a particular interest not only in the project but also in its visionary. "Your project is fascinating, Clara," he said in heavily accented Portuguese. "I'd love to learn more about it, perhaps over dinner?" The invitation caught Clara off guard. In recent months, she had been so focused on the project and uncovering her family's secrets that she barely had time to think about her personal life. Before she could respond, she noticed Peter watching the scene from afar, his face etched with concern. The ensuing weeks brought new challenges for everyone at Mendes Corporation. International interest in the Bridges to the Future project grew, accompanied by enticing proposals. James Thompson, in particular, seemed determined to expand the program globally. During business dinners with the English investor, Clara found herself torn. On one hand, the possibility of broadening the project's impact was tempting. On the other, there was something unsettling about the way Thompson spoke of turning the program into a global brand, as if reducing it to just another product. "We need to think big," he insisted during one particularly elegant dinner. "Imagine franchises of the program in London, New York, Tokyo." His eyes lit up when discussing numbers and projections, but Clara couldn't help noticing that he never mentioned the people the project was meant to help. Meanwhile, back at the company, Peter and Beatrice worked together to refine the talent identification system. The long hours spent together in the technology lab gradually softened the initial tension between them. One late night, while reviewing code, Beatrice finally mustered the courage to ask the question that had been on her mind. "Why have you never told me that you like Clara too?" Peter froze in front of the computer, his hands hovering over the keyboard. "Is it that obvious?" he asked after a long silence. "For anyone paying attention, yes," Beatrice replied, striving to keep her voice steady. "I see how you look at her, how you worry every time she goes out to dinner with Thompson." Their conversation was cut short by Helena's unexpected arrival with worrisome news. During a routine audit, she had uncovered inconsistencies in the figures presented by Thompson. "There's something off about the investments he's proposing," she explained, showing a series of spreadsheets. "The numbers just don't add up." This discovery placed Clara in a difficult position. Thompson had become not only a potential business partner, but also a close friend. However, her intuition, echoed by Helena's findings, warned that something was amiss with his proposals. Once again, it was Mrs. Gertrude who offered the necessary wisdom. "Your mother always had a sixth sense for numbers," she told Clara, during one of their afternoon coffees. "And you, my dear, inherited your father's heart for people. Trust both of them." Clara's decision was put to the test during a crucial meeting with international investors. Thompson presented his proposal for global expansion when Peter requested the floor. With Beatrice's help, he had developed a detailed analysis showing how Thompson's plan could completely distort the original spirit of the project. "Bridges to the Future isn't just a training program," argued Peter, his normally soft voice now laden with conviction. "It's a project that honors the humanity in each person, that values individual stories. Turning it into a standardized franchise would mean losing its essence." Clara watched Peter's presentation with a mix of admiration and clarity. At last, she understood why she felt so uncomfortable with Thompson's proposals. They epitomized the kind of corporate mentality the project sought to change. When Thompson asked her to take a stand, Clara did not hesitate. This project was born from an act of kindness on a cold night, she said, looking directly at her grandfather, who was joining the meeting via video conference from his hospital room. Its strength lies in its ability to recognize the unique value in every person. We cannot turn it into just another product. The decision to reject the international investment was difficult, but received unanimous support from the family. Thompson left the meeting visibly frustrated, vowing they would regret their decision. That night, as the team celebrated in the cafeteria, Clara observed Peter and Beatrice talking animatedly in a corner. There was something different in the way her cousin looked at the young programmer, something that went beyond professional admiration. Autumn arrived in New York City, tinting the trees along Madison Avenue with golden and reddish hues. Albert Mendez was finally discharged from the hospital, though he chose to work from home, dedicating his time to preparing the company's transition to the new generation. One particularly hectic morning, Clara received an urgent call from Marina. The press had published a series of reports questioning the legitimacy of the Bridges to the Future project, with details that could only have come from someone on the inside. The articles suggest that the project is merely a marketing ploy, explained Marina, her voice tense, and there are insinuations about its true relationship with the Mendez family. Clara didn't have to think long to identify the source of the leaks. James Thompson was fulfilling his promise of revenge. What she didn't expect was to find Beatrice in tears in the meeting room, clutching a flash drive in her hands. "Forgive me," Beatrice sobbed as soon as Clara entered. "At the start of the program, before I even knew we were cousins, I passed some information on to Thompson. He said it was for market research, but he kept everything to use against us if something went wrong." Peter, standing beside Beatrice, explained that they had discovered old emails showing that Thompson planned to use the project merely as a front for a larger real estate speculation scheme in the very neighborhoods where the program participants lived. "He didn't count on me developing a special backup of all the project documents," Peter said, a determined gleam in his eyes. "We have proof of his true intentions." Clara looked at her cousin, who now appeared genuinely remorseful. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked softly. "Because I learned from you that family isn't just about blood," Beatrice replied, wiping her tears. "It's about choice, it's about loyalty, and I choose to stand on the right side of this story." Helena, who had just arrived in the room, added more information. Her numerical expertise had allowed her to trace a suspicious pattern in Thompson's companies. "He's done this before in other countries," she explained, using social projects as a front for real estate speculation. This revelation mobilized the entire family. Even from home, Albert coordinated a task force to protect the project and its participants. Clara, Helena, and Beatrice worked tirelessly to compile a complete dossier on Thompson's true intentions. It was during this crisis that Clara noticed something important. Watching Peter comfort Beatrice, she observed how perfectly the two complemented each other. His shy nature balanced perfectly with her outgoing personality, and more importantly, she realized that her own heart no longer ached at the sight of them together. "Do you know what your father used to say?" Albert remarked from his chair as he observed the scene. "That a person's true value isn't measured by what they have, but by what they're willing to give to others." That night, the family gathered at Albert's home for a special dinner. Mrs. Gertrude was invited and brought her famous savory pies, while Mrs. Zephyr, now the coordinator of the project's culinary training program, prepared her traditional sweets. "I have something for you," Albert announced, asking Helena to bring an old box from his office. Inside lay a diary. It belonged to Richard. He wrote in it even up to his last day. Clara, Helena, and Beatrice huddled close as Albert opened the diary to its final entry. Richard's bold, determined handwriting filled the page. "Father, one day you'll understand that our family's true legacy isn't in the buildings we construct, but in the bridges we create between people." The following spring brought significant changes to Mendez Corporation. The allegations against Thompson became public, and the English businessman now faced investigations in several countries. Meanwhile, the Bridges to the Future project emerged from the crisis even stronger, its integrity and purpose recognized internationally. On a sunny morning, exactly 1 year after that cold winter night, when Clara had shared her only coat with a stranger, the Mendez family organized a special ceremony in the company auditorium. The venue was packed with employees, project participants, and special guests. Albert Mendez ascended the stage, leaning on his cane, yet his eyes shone with the same intensity as always. "1 year ago," he began, "I learned that sometimes we must lose ourselves to find the true path. My granddaughter Clara taught me that. Greatness isn't measured by the titles we carry, but by the gestures we share." He then announced the new company structure. Clara would assume the presidency of the Bridges to the Future Institute, which would become an independent organization dedicated to replicating the program in partnership with other companies. Helena was named the new financial director of the group, bringing her extraordinary numerical skill and human sensitivity to corporate management. To everyone's surprise, Beatrice chose to lead the company's social innovation division, working closely with Peter, who in addition to being the head of technology had become her fiancé. "My grandfather always said that love has the power to transform people," she declared in her speech. "But it was Clara who taught me that it can also transform companies and entire communities." Mrs. Ziefer, now coordinator of a culinary training program, smiled proudly alongside her students who were serving treats at the celebration. Among them was Jose, the former homeless man who had revolutionized the company gardens and now led a community gardening project. Mrs. Gertrude, on her last day before retirement, served coffee one final time in her beloved cafeteria. The space would be transformed into a community center bearing her name, a place where executives and project participants could gather, share experiences, and, most importantly, build bridges. Clara watched it all with a heart overflowing with emotion. Her gaze swept the audience, meeting faces that told stories of transformation. Employees who once eyed her with suspicion now stood applauding. People who had once lived on the streets now wore company ID badges. Families that had regained their dignity through work and opportunity. "Your father would be proud," Helena whispered, holding her daughter's hand. Clara smiled, thinking of how one simple act of kindness on a cold night had sparked a revolution of compassion and opportunity. At the end of the ceremony, Albert called the entire family onto the stage for a historic photo. Clara, Helena, Beatrice, Peter, Mrs. Gertrude, and Mrs. Zephyr, each representing an essential part of that transformative story. In the background, framed on a special wall, hung the old coat Clara had shared on that winter night. "You know what's most amazing?" Albert commented as they posed for the photo. "That night, I wasn't conducting some social experiment, was truly lost, weighed down by the burden of my past mistakes. Your act of kindness, Clara, not only warmed me against the cold, but also lit the way back home." When the photographer finished, Clara requested a moment of attention. "There's an old Brazilian tradition," she said, "that when we share something from the heart, the universe multiplies that kindness infinitely. Today, looking at each one of you, I realize that this tradition is true." In that moment, as the New York spring sunlight streamed through the auditorium's stained glass windows, painting a kaleidoscope of colors on the gathered faces, Clara understood that her true legacy wasn't found in the towering buildings of Madison Avenue or in the Mendez family bank accounts. It lay in the bridges she had helped build, bridges between people, between worlds, between dreams and reality. And so, on that spring morning, exactly 1 year after a cold winter night when a young woman shared her only coat with a stranger, the story of kindness transformed into a legacy of hope and transformation, a living testament that the greatest treasures we build are not made of concrete and steel, but of generosity and love. The end.